The morning the stagecoach rolled into Caldwell, Kansas, carrying a woman with a medicine bag instead of a trousseau, was the morning everything Holt Calloway thought he knew about himself began to unravel at the seams. It was the spring of 1879, and the sun had already climbed high enough over the flat prairie horizon to bake the ruts in the main street into something resembling cracked pottery. Caldwell sat just north of the Kansas Indian Territory line, a town that smelled of cattle and ambition in roughly equal measure, where men came to sell their herds and drink their profits and occasionally end up face-down in the dirt outside the Blue Roan Saloon. It was not a gentle town, and it did not attract gentle people, and that, more than anything else, was why Holt Calloway had decided that he needed a wife who could hold her own. He had sent for her through a matrimonial agency out of St. Louis, the kind that published notices in newspapers across the eastern states, promising adventure and partnership to women willing to come west. He had written his letter with careful deliberation, sitting at the scarred kitchen table of his ranch house with a stub of pencil and a sheet of paper that had been folded and refolded so many times it was nearly soft as cloth. He had described his land, his cattle operation, his house of 2 full rooms with a sleeping loft above. He had described himself honestly enough: 31 years old, 6 feet and a half inch tall, brown hair going a little rough at the temples from too much sun, no criminal record, no debts he could not cover by autumn. He had said he wanted a capable woman, a practical woman, someone who understood that life on the frontier was not a drawing-room affair. What he had expected was someone who could cook a side of beef over an open fire, mend a saddle blanket, and perhaps sing something quiet and sweet on Sunday evenings when the work was done. What stepped off the stagecoach instead was Nora Ellison, 24 years old, with a worn leather medicine bag over one shoulder and the particular kind of calm in her eyes that belongs to people who have looked at things most folks prefer not to see. She was not plain, and she was not what anyone would call conventionally beautiful in the way that the illustrated magazines back east described their heroines. She was something more arresting than that, strong-boned and clear-eyed, with dark auburn hair pinned up in a practical knot that had lost a few strands to the prairie wind before she even reached the bottom of the coach steps. Her dress was a deep blue-gray that had been washed so many times it had taken on the muted quality of the sky just before a storm breaks. She carried herself like someone who had decided long ago not to spend energy being uncertain about where she was going, even when she did not quite know. Holt was leaning against the post outside Garfield's dry goods store when she stepped down, and he pushed himself upright with a sort of automatic courtesy that his mother had drilled into him years before she died. He crossed the street, already composing the polite but firm words he would use to welcome her, already running through the list of domestic necessities he needed handled before the summer drive season consumed his every waking hour. He held out his hand and said his name. She shook it with a firm, dry grip and said hers. He looked at the medicine bag. She watched him look at it. "I am a physician," she said, in a tone that was neither apologetic nor aggressive, simply factual, the way a person states the color of the sky. "Trained at the Woman's Medical College of Pennsylvania. I completed my degree 2 years ago. I have been practicing in Philadelphia since then." Holt stared at her for a moment that stretched 3 seconds too long. A wagon rolled past, raising a curtain of dust. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and gave up. "I ordered a wife," he said, "not a doctor." Nora Ellison looked at him with those steady gray eyes and said, "It appears you got both. I suggest we make the best of it." The drive to the ranch took the better part of an hour in Holt's buckboard wagon, with his gray mare, Patience, pulling them at a pace that seemed slightly insulted by the name. The road, if it could be dignified with that word, was more of a suggestion pressed into the grass by repeated wheel traffic, and it wound southwest through rolling tallgrass that was already beginning to go green and gold with the season. The sky was enormous in the way that it always is on the Kansas plains, a vast blue dome that pressed down at the edges and made a person feel simultaneously very small and very exposed. They did not speak much during the ride. Holt was working through his feelings with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had learned that most problems, if you approached them squarely, had some kind of workable solution somewhere inside them. The problem, as he saw it, was not that Nora Ellison was a physician. The problem was that he had written a letter asking for a partner in building a life, and a woman from St. Louis had matched him with someone who already had a life fully constructed in another city. A doctor did not leave a practice in Philadelphia to mend saddle blankets and fry salt pork. A doctor left Philadelphia for a reason, and Holt was not at all certain he was going to like the reason. For her part, Nora was watching the land unspool around the wagon with an attention that was quietly intense, cataloging the grasses, the distance between water features, the condition of the cattle she could see scattered across the horizon. She had not told Holt the full truth yet. She had told him that she was a doctor. She had not told him about the other part, the reason she had answered the advertisement in the first place, the thing she had left behind in Philadelphia that had made the frontier, with all its hardship and uncertainty, feel like the more appealing option. She would tell him eventually. She always told the truth eventually. She had found that lies, no matter how small and carefully constructed, had a way of collapsing at the worst possible moments, usually because there was some detail you could not predict that the truth would have handled gracefully. The ranch, when it came into view, was not what she had imagined and was exactly what the letter had described, which meant her imagination had simply been inadequate. The house was a solid, low-slung structure of limestone block and cedar plank, built into a slight rise in the land, so that the front porch caught the southwest breeze in summer. There was a barn that was in better condition than the house, which told her something significant about the man sitting beside her. There were 3 wooden outbuildings in varying states of repair, a well with a good windmill, a kitchen garden that had been dug but not yet planted this season, and a corral where several horses moved in their slow, private way. A ranch hand named Deke Prout came out of the barn when the wagon pulled up, a lean, weathered man of about 50, with a face like sun-dried leather and eyes that missed nothing. He took one look at Nora and her medicine bag, and looked at Holt with an expression that said several complicated things simultaneously. Holt shook his head very slightly, which apparently communicated enough, because Deke nodded once and went back to what he had been doing. Nora climbed down from the wagon without waiting for assistance and carried her own trunk toward the house. Holt caught up to take the heavier end without being asked, which she allowed without comment. They were already negotiating, she thought. That was promising. The interior of the house was clean in the way that places are clean when a man has made a genuine effort for company. Everything swept and ordered with more care than it was usually maintained. There was a cast-iron stove that was good and solid, a table and 4 chairs, a shelf of a few books that had been read rather than displayed, a braided rag rug on the plank floor. The sleeping loft above was accessed by a steep-pitched ladder. Everything smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, and faintly of cattle. "There is the loft," Holt said, setting the trunk down with a deliberateness that communicated clearly that they were going to be discussing the particulars of their arrangement. I had expected that we would discuss the terms of that there would be a wedding," Nora said calmly. "Yes, I assumed as much. I also assumed that we were both adults and that you would want some time to consider whether you actually want to proceed, given that the arrangement is not what you anticipated." Holt blinked. It was the second time in one day that this woman had said aloud the thing he was trying to say without quite saying it. "And what do you want?" he asked. "I want to be honest with you," she said. "I think we should sit down." They sat at the kitchen table and she told him. Her voice was measured and clear, and she looked at him directly while she spoke, the way she had learned to look at patients when delivering difficult news, with steadiness rather than distance. because steadiness was a kindness and distance was only avoidance in formal dress. She told him about Dr. Marcus Cal, who had been her mentor at the Philadelphia hospital, and whom she had trusted completely for 2 years, right up until the moment she discovered that he had been systematically submitting her work under his name to the medical journals, that the papers which had earned him his recent appointment as department chair had been her research, her conclusions, her words. She told him that she had confronted him, and that he had laughed at her in the way that powerful men laugh at inconvenient truths, and that when she had gone to the hospital administration, she had been told with great courtesy and very little actual concern that the matter would be investigated, and that in the meantime perhaps she would consider whether her position at the hospital was quite suited to her temperament. She had been given a generous separation sum, and a letter of reference so carefully worded as to be essentially neutral. She told him that she had received this news in January, and had spent February and most of March being angry about it in the small, precise rooms of her rented Philadelphia lodgings. She told him that she had seen the advertisement in April, and had answered it not because she was finished being angry, but because she was finished being still. When she finished speaking, the kitchen was quiet except for the wind pressing against the window glass and the distant sound of cattle on the open range. Holt Calloway sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him, looking at them as if he were checking that they were still his. Then he looked up at her. "You did not mention any of that in your letter to the agency," he said. "No," she agreed. "I mentioned that I was educated and capable and willing to work, all of which remains true." "A doctor," he said again, but differently this time, less like a complaint and more like someone testing the weight of a new word. "A doctor," she confirmed, "who can also cook, so manage a household ledger and plant a kitchen garden if you are worried about the practical side of things." Something crossed his face that might have been, under other circumstances, the beginning of a smile. He suppressed it with the ease of long practice. "Caldwell does not have a physician," he said, after a moment. "I noticed that," she said. Another silence. Outside, Deke Prout was singing something tuneless and off-key near the barn. "The nearest doctor is 22 miles north in Wichita," Holt said. "I know what 22 miles means to a man with a gunshot wound or a woman in difficult labor," Nora said quietly. Holt rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. It was a gesture she would come to recognize the particular way he organized his thoughts by applying friction to the stubborn problem of his own uncertainty. "I suppose we will figure it out," he said finally. It was not poetry. It was not even particularly reassuring. But it was honest, and from a man who had just received news that would have sent some people directly back to the stagecoach depot, honesty seemed like a reasonable place to start. They were married 3 days later by the circuit preacher, a cheerful, round-faced man named Josiah Briggs who came through Caldwell every 6 weeks, and who conducted the ceremony in the front room of the house with Deke Prout, and a ranch hand named Teddy Ortega as witnesses. It was not an elaborate ceremony. There were no orange blossoms. There was cornbread and a pot of beans afterward, and Deke produced a bottle of remarkably decent whiskey that he had been keeping for a special occasion, and poured 3 fingers for everyone, including Nora, who drank hers with the efficiency of someone who had used whiskey professionally and was not put off by the taste. Holt slept in the barn for the first 2 weeks. Not because anyone asked him to, but because it seemed like the proper thing to do for a woman who was still finding her feet in a strange place, and because Holt Calloway, for all his frontier roughness, had a code of decency that was his own and that he kept to quietly, without making a performance of it. Nora spent those first 2 weeks learning the ranch. She woke before dawn with the same discipline that had seen her through medical school, the only woman in her graduating class of 9. A fact she had never mentioned as remarkable because to her it was simply true. And she made coffee and biscuits while the light was still gray, and she had the stove going and the table set by the time Holt came in from his morning chores. She watched how the ranch operated, asked questions that were direct without being intrusive, and spent her afternoons establishing a small consultation space in the front room, where she arranged the contents of her medicine bag, with the careful economy of someone who understood that supplies here would not be easily replaced. Within 10 days of her arrival, word had spread through the county in that mysterious way of frontier communities, where news travels on the wind whether anyone has carried it or not, and the first patients began to appear. A cowboy from a neighboring spread with a festered hand that had been ignored for too long. A farmwife from 4 miles east with a cough that had been troubling her since February. The blacksmith's apprentice with 3 broken fingers, badly set by himself in a moment of determined but uninformed optimism. Holt watched this from a careful distance, which was itself a form of watching closely. He noticed the way she spoke to her patients, the matter-of-fact warmth of it, the way she never talked down or talked around but always directly, and always with the particular respect of someone who understood that people's bodies were their own business and their own burden, and that being trusted with them was a privilege. He noticed the way a frightened boy of about 12 became calm within minutes of sitting across from her. He noticed the way Deke Prout, who distrusted most people on principle and all physicians on additional principle, had begun to tip his hat to her when she crossed the yard. He was not falling in love yet. He was, if he were being precise about it, falling into a kind of bewildered admiration, which is sometimes what love looks like from the outside before you recognize it for what it is. The trouble began in late May, with the arrival of the drovers. Every spring, the cattle drives that originated in Texas moved north through the Indian Territory and into Kansas along the Kishom Trail, and the herds that reached Caldwell were met by buyers and brokers, and all the associated industry of men with money and cattle in the same place at the same time. The town swelled in population during the drive season, and with the swelling came all the things that money and idleness and proximity to a saloon reliably produced. There was a particular outfit camped outside town that spring. The Vander crew out of the Texas Panhandle, rough men under rougher management, trail-hardened and short-tempered in the way that 2 months of dust and heat and bad water makes any creature short-tempered. Their trail boss, a man named Cole Vander, was the kind of person who had been given authority too young and had learned nothing useful from it since. He was 28, broad across the shoulders, handsome in a raw and uncomplicated way, and absolutely certain at all times that what he wanted was what was right. Nora encountered him on a Wednesday afternoon when she had come into town to replenish her quinine supply at Garfield's store. He was at the counter when she arrived, buying tobacco and dispensing his opinion on a range of local matters to the store's owner with the expansive confidence of a man who considers himself visiting royalty. He turned when she came in and looked at her with the particular look that some men give women they consider to be unaccompanied resources. Nora looked back at him with the particular look she gave people who needed to recalibrate their assumptions, which was calm and direct, and entirely without the blush or the downward glance he was expecting. This, she would reflect later, was where she made her first mistake, not in the look, which was entirely appropriate, but in the fact that she did not anticipate the kind of man who interprets indifference as a personal affront. Vander followed her out of the store when she left. He said several things in the street, charming at first and then less so, following the predictable arc of a man who has never been told no by someone he wanted something from. The conversation attracted attention, because the main street of Caldwell in May was never empty, and the marshal, a quiet, competent man named Archie Hollies, stepped out of his office across the street and watched with the expression of someone who was prepared to intervene if necessary, but was currently assessing necessity. Holt had come into town that afternoon to arrange freight pickup for some equipment he had ordered from Wichita. He heard Vander's voice before he turned the corner, recognized the particular tone of it. He had been around enough cattle operations to know the voices of various kinds of men, and came around the corner to find Nora standing on the boardwalk in front of Garfield's store with her medicine bag in one hand and her back straight, and her expression perfectly composed, speaking in a low and measured voice to Cole Vander about why she was not interested in his company. Holt stopped walking. He assessed the situation in the same methodical way he assessed everything, which took him about 4 seconds, and then he crossed the street. What he did not do was raise his voice, draw a weapon, or make any kind of dramatic announcement. He simply walked up next to Nora, put his hand gently, unhurriedly at her side, and said to Vander, "Evening, Cole. These are my wife's errands, so I expect she will be finishing them without further conversation." The word wife did a great deal of work in that sentence. It was not the word that resolved the situation. Exactly. Vander was not the sort of man who was restrained by social convention when he wanted something. But it was the word that, combined with the flatness of Holt's voice and the steadiness of his eyes, communicated that the cost of continuing this conversation had just changed significantly. Vander looked at Holt with the calculating look of a man who is deciding whether a fight is worth what it would cost him. He was a big man, but Holt was not small, and more importantly, Holt had the kind of stillness that men who have spent years handling animals that outweigh them by 1,000 pounds develop as a matter of survival. A stillness that conveys an absolute absence of anxiety about what happens next. Vander smiled, which was the smile of a man who was retreating while trying to look like he was choosing not to advance, which is a different thing entirely, and everyone present understood the difference. He said something light and meaningless and turned away, and Nora watched him go and then looked at Holt. "Thank you," she said. "I did not do it to rescue you," he said matter-of-factly. "I did it because he was wasting your time." Nora looked at him for a moment and felt something shift very quietly in her chest, the way a door shifts on a good set of hinges, not swinging open, but no longer closed in quite the same way. "That," she said, "is precisely the right reason." That evening, Holt moved out of the barn. He moved back into the house and climbed the ladder to the loft and slept in his own bed without ceremony or discussion. And in the morning, when Nora came down from the loft, there had been a brief, practical, entirely unawkward negotiation about the sleeping arrangements that had concluded with both of them agreeing that 2 adults sharing a sleeping loft was not a scandal. She made coffee, and he brought eggs from the henhouse, and they had breakfast in companionable silence, with the prairie morning light coming through the east window in long gold bars that lay across the kitchen table like promises. The kitchen garden got planted in the first week of June. It was a joint enterprise that neither of them had explicitly agreed to make joint, but which became joint naturally, in the way that things do when 2 people are occupying the same space and have the same task in front of them. Holt turned the soil with a spade, and Nora followed behind him, laying out seeds in careful rows, medicinal herbs, of course, but also onions and carrots and beans and summer squash, and a row of sunflowers along the south fence that Holt regarded skeptically. "Sunflowers do not feed anyone," he said. "They feed the spirit," she said, pressing seeds into the earth with the same precise care she used for everything she did with her hands. "The spirit can manage," he said, though he did not uproot the seeds she had planted, and 2 months later, when the sunflowers were standing 8 feet tall along the south fence and throwing their bold, ridiculous yellow faces at the sky, he did not mention them, but she noticed that he never walked past them without looking up. June and July were full and various and good. Nora's practice grew in the organic, word-of-mouth way of frontier medicine, where trust is built not through advertising, but through the specific testimony of people whose pain was acknowledged and addressed. She delivered 2 babies in June, one in town and one at a homestead 8 miles west, a difficult birth that required everything she had learned, and a kind of steady courage that comes not from fearlessness but from choosing, very deliberately, not to let fear be in charge. Both mothers and both babies survived, which was not guaranteed in 1879 and was not to be taken lightly. Holt gave her one of the better horses for her rounds, a bay gelding with the unfortunate name of Whiskey, which she kept because renaming a horse is a complicated business. He checked the tack himself before her morning rides and said nothing about it when she noticed him doing so, and she said nothing either, but she thought about it. They talked in the evenings. That was, she thought later, when everything important happened between them, not in the dramatic moments, not in the crises, but in the quiet evenings on the porch after supper when the heat was finally relenting, and the stars were beginning to accumulate in the deep Kansas sky, and there was nothing pressing to be done. They talked about the land, about cattle prices, about the political situation in the territory, about the exodusters, the freed black men and women who had been arriving in Kansas by the thousands over the past year, following the promise of homestead land, and the complicated, often painful reality of what they found when they got there. Nora had strong opinions about this, about the injustice of what had brought them from the South, about the systemic barriers they encountered even here, even in free Kansas, about the gap between what the land promised and what it actually delivered to people who arrived with nothing after having had everything taken from them. She said these things with the directness of someone who had spent 2 years in a Philadelphia hospital treating poor patients regardless of their color or origin, and who had seen clearly that the quality of a person's suffering had nothing to do with who they were and everything to do with what resources were available to address it. Holt listened. He was not a man who listened passively. He listened with his whole attention, which was something Nora noticed because she was a physician and listening was her profession, and she could tell the difference. He had his own views, forged by growing up in Missouri and coming west at 19, by working alongside men of every background on cattle drives where competence was the only currency that mattered. He did not always agree with her, and he said so without anger, and she responded without anger, and they discovered that the particular pleasure of disagreeing thoughtfully with someone you respect is one of the great underrated satisfactions of human connection. In early August, the trouble with Vander resumed. Vander's crew had stayed on in Caldwell longer than most, because the sale of their herd had been complicated by a dispute over head count, and the delay had been expensive and humiliating, and Vander had been drinking off and on for 2 weeks and making himself progressively less welcome in every establishment in town. He had not approached Nora again after the incident in May. Holt's quiet, absolute presence had communicated clearly enough. But he had not forgotten her, and in the specific way of petty men, he had been sitting with the memory of having been made to feel small and letting it ferment into something uglier. The catalyst was a Saturday night and too much whiskey at the Blue Roan, and the target was not Nora but Holt. Holt had come into town for supplies and had stopped into the Blue Roan for a single drink, which was his custom on Saturday evenings, a habit of exactly one drink that he maintained with the same stubborn precision with which he maintained everything else he cared about. Vander was at the bar in the late afternoon company of 2 of his remaining drovers, and he found, in the loose and dangerous reasoning of a man who has been drinking for several hours, that Holt Calloway was the specific cause of all his recent misfortunes. The argument that followed was brief, and in the way of such arguments, not really about anything that was said. Holt said very little. Vander said a great deal, including several things about Nora that Holt heard with a stillness that was, if you knew what to look for, the specific stillness of a man who is keeping a very short leash on a very strong reaction. The punch was Vander's, and it connected, which surprised Holt slightly because he had been watching for it and had misjudged the angle. He went back against the bar and came upright immediately, and the fight that followed was short and not particularly elegant, and ended with Vander on the floor and his 2 companions deciding that their involvement was not going to improve the situation. Marshal Hollis arrived before anything worse happened. Vander was arrested for disturbing the peace and held overnight. Holt walked home with split knuckles and a cut above his left eyebrow, and a bruised rib on the right side that he discovered when he took a deep breath outside the Blue Roan and felt the specific, unpleasant protest of stressed cartilage. Nora was on the porch when he came up the path to the house. It was close to 10 o'clock and the stars were out in their full August extravagance, and she had been reading by the light of the oil lamp she had carried outside, and she looked up when she heard his footsteps and then looked more carefully when she saw the way he was walking. She set her book down and went to him without hurry, brought the lamp up to see his face, and did her assessment with the same calm efficiency with which she assessed everything. "Sit down," she said. "It is fine," he said. "Sit down, Holt." He sat on the porch steps, and she cleaned the cut above his eye with water and a piece of clean cloth, threading the lamp between them so she could see what she was doing, and he sat still under her hands with the same patience that a good horse sits still for things it does not particularly enjoy but understands to be necessary. "The rib," she said, when she had dealt with his eye. "How did you know about the rib?" he asked. "You are breathing about 20% shallower on the right side than the left," she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him, professionally composed, holding a small roll of cloth bandage. He took off his shirt with the resigned air of a man who has decided that arguing with a physician is approximately as productive as arguing with the weather, and she wrapped his ribs with the efficient competence of someone who had done this many times before, and her hands were steady and careful and warm, and the night was enormous and quiet around them, and Holt Calloway sat very still on his own porch steps under a Kansas sky full of stars and understood, with a clarity that was almost startling in its completeness, that he was in love with his wife. He did not say so, not yet. It was August and they had been married 4 months, and there were things that needed to be said in the right order, and he had not yet determined the right order. But he knew it, with the same kind of bone-deep certainty with which he knew when a storm was coming or when a horse was about to bolt, the knowledge that lives below thought in the body, in the steady thump of the heart against the chest. What he said, when she had finished binding his ribs and sat back to examine her work, was, "Thank you." "You are welcome," she said. Then, after a pause, "Cole Vander. He will be at Marshall Hollis's overnight," Holt said. "And tomorrow his cattle are sold and he leaves Caldwell." Holt paused. "I expect he will not return." Nora nodded, and she folded the extra bandage with the neat, automatic movements of a woman whose hands knew the work without instruction, and she looked out at the dark prairie for a moment with the expression of someone who is considering several things at once. "You did not have to do that," she said. "Start a fight over what he said." "I did not start it," Holt said. "He did, but you could have walked away." "Yes," Holt agreed. "I could have." Nora looked at him. He looked back at her. The lamp threw warm light up between them, and the night pressed in from all sides, and there was a silence that was different from their other silences, charged, like the air before lightning, not threatening but alive. "Go to bed," she said finally, "and try not to roll onto your right side." She went inside. He stayed on the steps for a few minutes longer looking at the stars, and then he followed her. September arrived, and with it the beginning of the turn toward harvest, the days still golden, but the mornings carrying a bite of what was coming. The cattle operation was moving toward its autumn rhythm, and Holt was occupied from before dawn to after dark with the work of the season, but he found that there was now an organizing principle to the days that had not existed before. The breakfast that was always ready, the supper that was sometimes ready and sometimes required his participation, because Nora had been out on a call until evening, the evenings on the porch that were beginning to find a shape that felt permanent, felt like a life rather than an arrangement. He brought her wildflowers once. He had not done it consciously or with forethought. He had been riding the fence line on the eastern boundary of the ranch, and had passed through a stand of late-season goldenrod and prairie asters that were going particularly brilliant in the September light, and he had simply, without really deciding to, gathered a handful and carried them home and set them in an old tin cup of water on the kitchen table. He was at the barn when she got home from her afternoon round and found them, and he watched her through the barn door. which was absolutely not what he had meant to be doing. He told himself, and absolutely what he was doing, and saw her come through the front door of the house and stop and look at the flowers in the tin cup on the table and stand still for a moment with her hand resting against the doorframe. Then she went in and he went back to the horse he was supposed to be working on. And that evening, she put a small pressed aster on the table beside his plate without comment, and he looked at it, and she looked at him, and they ate their supper in the warmth of something that neither of them had put into words yet, but which both of them understood completely. The moment the words arrived was not the romantic moment that the storybooks would have arranged, because life is not a storybook, and the frontier is not a stage set. And the thing that brought Holt Calloway to the moment of speaking the most important words of his adult life was a rattlesnake. He was repairing a section of fence on the western pasture on a warm October morning, working alone because Deke and Teddy were moving cattle to the southern pasture, and the grass was still long enough at the fence post base that he did not see the snake until it was coiling, and by the time his body completed the instinctive backward movement, it was already too late. The strike was fast and low and caught him on the inside of his right calf, above the boot top, and the pain was immediate and specific, and he knew exactly what it was. He killed the snake with the fence post maul, which was the logical thing to do. He sat down on the ground, because sitting was better than falling, and he looked at the bite, 2 clean puncture marks already beginning to swell, and he thought about the distance to the ranch house and the distance to town, and made his calculations with the systematic thoroughness of a man who has been alone on the frontier long enough to know that panic is the most expensive luxury available. He got to his horse. Getting to his horse required covering 50 yards on a leg that was already hot and beginning to stiffen, and it was not a pleasant 50 yards, but he managed it and mounted and turned the horse toward the ranch house at a controlled pace, because galloping would have driven his heart rate up, and his heart rate was already doing what adrenaline instructed, and that was not helpful. He made it to the yard. He called for Nora, and she came out of the house immediately and crossed to him at a fast walk that was almost a run, and he said, very calmly, "Snake. Right calf. 20 minutes ago, approximately." She was already at his leg before he finished the sentence. What happened in the next 40 minutes was the most impressive thing Holt had ever witnessed in 41 years of witnessing things. Later, thinking about it, he would try to find the words for it and conclude that what he had seen was mastery, the specific, earned mastery of someone who has prepared for something so thoroughly that when the moment arrives, preparation becomes instinct. There was no panic in her. There was no hesitation. There was only the swift, certain sequence of someone who knew exactly what needed to happen, and in what order, and was doing it with the full and absolute engagement of her complete self. She got him inside and onto the kitchen table. He objected to this once, and she simply kept moving, and he found himself on the kitchen table. She cut his trouser leg from ankle to knee and cleaned the bite site and made her assessment of the fang spread and the swelling progression and the coloration of the tissue around the punctures. She checked his pulse, his respiration, the color of his lips. She asked him several questions about how he was feeling. His responses were calm and honest because he was, despite everything, clear-headed enough to know that lying to your physician when your physician is trying to keep you alive is counterproductive. She had rattlesnake antivenom. She had brought it from Philadelphia because she had read everything available about frontier medicine before she came west, and she had read the reports from the territorial physicians about snakebite mortality, and she had packed antivenom in her medicine bag with the same foresight with which she packed everything. Not because she expected to need it, but because the cost of not having it was too high to risk. She administered the treatment with perfect precision, elevated his leg, gave him laudanum for the pain in a dose she measured by weight and symptoms, and a dozen other factors she was calculating simultaneously. And she sat beside the kitchen table for the next 3 hours, and monitored him with the patience of someone who understands that medicine is mostly waiting, and that the quality of your waiting is what determines whether the patient trusts you enough to let your treatment work. The fever spiked at about midday and came down by mid-afternoon. She packed the site with a poultice that reduced the swelling in a way that Holt, through the considerable discomfort of the next several hours, could acknowledge was remarkable. By evening, he was uncomfortable rather than in crisis, which was not the same as well but was substantially better than the alternative. He was lying on the kitchen table with a folded quilt under his head, and his right leg elevated on a wooden crate, and a cup of willow bark tea that Nora had pressed into his hands, because she understood the specific relationship between pain and rest, and how very little rest happens when a person is in sufficient pain to prevent it. She was sitting in the chair beside the table, writing in her medical journal by the lamplight, the way she wrote up every significant case, her pen moving in quick, careful strokes, recording everything. He watched her for a while in the lamplight. Her face in concentration was a different face than her face in conversation. It was more private, more interior, the face a person shows only when they have forgotten they are being watched. "Nora," he said. She looked up from her journal. "I would have died," he said. It was not a statement designed for effect. He said it the way he said everything, plainly, because plain was what he knew how to do, because he had found over 31 years that plain was usually sufficient and usually honest. "Possibly," she said. "Rattlesnake bites are not always fatal, even without treatment, but with the location and the amount of venom, yes, it was serious." "You saved my life," he said. She put her pen down and looked at him properly. "Yes," she said. "I think I did." "I said a stupid thing," he told her. "At the stagecoach, when I said I ordered a wife and not a doctor." Nora's expression shifted in the lamplight, something moving through it that she did not suppress quickly enough. Something that was composed of many things, relief and tenderness, and something that might have been the bright edge of tears if she were the sort of person who let tears be the first response to things that moved her, which she was not, but the feeling was there. "You said an honest thing," she said. "You said what you were thinking." "It was still stupid," he said. "It was what it was," she said. "We are past it." "I want to say something else," he said. She waited, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes steady on his face. "I love you," Holt Calloway said. His voice was level and his eyes were clear, and he said it the way he said everything, directly, without ornament, without retreat. "I have been thinking about how to say it for 2 months, and I have not been able to find a better way to say it than that. I love you, and I am sorry it took a rattlesnake to get me to say it." The room was very quiet. Then Nora Ellison, who had grown up in a household of scientists and had trained in medicine, and had always found that the most direct route between 2 points was a straight line, said, "I love you too. I have been waiting for you to say it first because I thought you needed more time, and I was trying to be patient, which does not come naturally to me." Holt looked at her with an expression that was new on his face, open in a way she had not yet seen it, all the careful reserve folded back like a shutter letting in morning light. "You could have said it first," he said. "I know," she said. "I was trying to be strategic." "How is that working out for you?" "Poorly," she admitted. "But we have arrived at the same place regardless." He reached out and took her hand from where it rested on the arm of the chair, and she let him, and his grip was warm and firm and careful, the grip of a man who knows his own strength and chooses, in this moment, gentleness. "There is still the matter of my being a doctor," she said. "There is no longer any matter," he said. "There is only my wife, who is a doctor and who saved my life today, and who I intend to be married to for a very long time." Nora smiled. It was the first full, unguarded smile he had seen from her, the kind that involved her whole face, reached her eyes, changed the whole architecture of her expression. And it was, he thought, possibly the best thing he had ever seen in his life, including the best sunsets over the Kansas plains and the particular gold of tallgrass in October light. He recovered fully over the following week. He was not a patient. She had suspected this and was correct, and managing his tendency to consider himself well before he actually was required her firmest physician's manner. Deployed with the dry humor she had discovered, was the most effective tool for handling him, because Holt Calloway's sense of humor was quiet but genuine, and he responded to it better than to direct confrontation. She told him on day 3 that if he attempted to climb into the saddle before she cleared him for it, she would tell Deke. And since Deke had apparently been watching over Holt with the worried concern of a man who was not comfortable with worried concern, and was expressing it as irritated surveillance, this threat was effective. He was cleared for light activity by day 5, for riding by day 8, and by the end of October he was back to full operation, with a scar on his right calf that he regarded occasionally and said nothing about. The town of Caldwell began to understand that winter what it had gained. Nora established a proper practice room in the house by November, with Holt's help. They rearranged the front room and built additional shelving, and he rode to Wichita and brought back the medical supplies she had ordered, navigating the purchase with the same careful attention to the specifics that he applied to everything he did for her, which was by now everything he did at all, in the sense that she had become the organizing fact of his life, and he made no apologies for it. She had, over the autumn, treated a dozen significant cases and managed twice that many minor ones, and she had delivered 4 babies, and she had dealt firmly and successfully with a diphtheria outbreak in a family of homesteaders northeast of town, reaching them in time because she had trained herself to never ignore an early report of trouble, having learned from her Philadelphia years that early attention prevents late catastrophe. The marshal's deputy had told Marshal Hollis, who had told the mayor, who had told everyone he encountered, that the physician out at the Calloway ranch was the best thing that had happened to the county since the railway connection to Wichita. Deke Prout, who had arrived at his own opinion by his own route, had told Teddy Ortega one morning in the barn that Mrs. Calloway was going to outlast all of them, which Teddy understood to be a significant compliment, coming from Deke. The first snow arrived in November, light and dry, sifting over the prairie in the kind of way that is beautiful if you are inside and problematic if you are not. Holt came in from the afternoon chores with the cold still on him, and Nora had soup on the stove. She had learned his preferences over 6 months and made adjustments she did not announce, which was how she communicated things that felt too domestic to say directly, which was itself a kind of tenderness she had not previously known she was capable of, and they ate together in the warm kitchen, with the snow moving past the window glass and the oil lamp making everything amber and close. After supper, he took out the worn deck of cards that lived on the shelf beside the books, and they played cribbage, which she had taught him in October when he was recovering and needed occupation for his hands. He had become, she noted, a very good cribbage player in a short time, which did not surprise her, because she had discovered that Holt Calloway was good at everything he decided to be good at, and he had decided to be good at cribbage because it gave him a legitimate reason to sit across a table from her for an hour every evening. She pegged 3 points and looked at him across the board. He was looking at her with that particular steady look that she had come to understand meant he was about to say something he had been arranging for a while. "What?" she said. "I'm going to build on the house next spring," he said. "Add a proper room for your practice. Separate entrance from the road so patients do not come through our kitchen." Nora set down her cards. "You have been thinking about this for a while," she said. "Since October," he confirmed. "I drew some plans. They are rough." He got up and brought a folded piece of paper from the shelf, the paper covered in pencil lines in the careful, measured hand of a man who had taught himself architectural drafting from the kind of careful observation of structures that practical necessity produces on the frontier. The plans were, as he said, rough, but they were thoughtful. He had considered the light, the access, the relationship between the new space and the existing rooms. He had left room for a waiting area. Nora studied the plans for a long time. He sat back down and watched her looking at them, and there was a quality in his watching that was patient and a little vulnerable, the way a person looks when they have made something and brought it to someone they care about and the opinion matters enough to be nerve-wracking. "This is very good," she said. He exhaled slightly. I want to put the supply room on the north side, she said, so it stays cooler in summer. Some medications are affected by heat. That makes sense, he said immediately. And this waiting area, I would like a window on the east side if we can manage it. We can manage it, he said. She looked at him over the plans. Holt, she said. Yes. This is a very large thing you are doing. You are my wife, he said simply. Your work matters. It matters to you, and it matters to a great many people who would otherwise have no one. Building a better space for it is not a large thing. It is the correct thing. Nora looked down at the plans again, and he saw, just briefly, that the particular quality of her composure had shifted, that she was holding something back with the focused effort that people make when they are moved and do not want to be seen being moved, which told him everything he needed to know about how much the gesture had mattered. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers lightly, and she turned her hand over and gripped his fingers and held on for a moment, and then let go and picked up her cards. Your deal, she said. He dealt the cards with a small, private smile that she did not see because she was looking at her hand, and he was very glad she did not see it, because there are some feelings that are best kept between a man and himself, at least until they have been lived with long enough to take full shape. Winter on the Kansas plains in 1879 was formidable in the specific, unrelenting way that the plains are formidable, not the dramatic, mountainous cold of further north, but a sustained, pervasive cold that settled into the bones of the land, and its inhabitants with the patience of something that has nowhere better to be. The drifts came in January, and the temperature dropped to places that turned exposed skin to pain within minutes, and made every necessary outdoor task into an exercise in methodical endurance. Nora's practice slowed in the deep of winter, as it did for all frontier physicians, because travel in blizzard conditions was a negotiation between necessity and survival that most families handled by staying home and enduring. But there were still calls, and she made them for the truly urgent. She made them regardless of the weather, bundled in layers and mounted on Whiskey, who had proved to be a better cold-weather horse than his name suggested, navigating the drifts with a stolid, experienced competence. Holt did not forbid these winter rides. He did not operate on the principle of forbidding, which Nora had identified early as one of his most attractive qualities. What he did was come with her, on the truly dangerous nights, without discussion, simply appearing with his own horse saddled when she was preparing to leave, saying nothing about it, accepting no argument. She found, after the first time, that she did not particularly want to argue. There was a specific comfort in riding through a January dark with someone beside you who you trusted completely, whose presence did not require explanation or management, who was simply there. They came home from a difficult birth call in late January, a homestead 8 miles south. A young mother of 19 who had been alone with her first pregnancy for too long before anyone thought to send word, coming home through 2 feet of snow in the dark, with Nora's breath clouding in the lamplight. She was holding and both horses breathing steam into the cold air, and the baby they had left behind was alive, and the mother was alive, and that was everything. Holt took the horses and she went inside and built up the fire. And when he came in from the barn, she had coffee hot in his chair pulled close to the stove, and he sat down in it with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been cold for too long, and she sat in her own chair, and they drank their coffee in the firelight, and said nothing at all for a long time, and it was the best kind of silence. The silence of two people who are so thoroughly together that words are supplementary. You did extraordinary work tonight, he said eventually. She curled her hands around her cup. The mother did extraordinary work. I just managed the particulars. That, he said, is a very modest way of describing what I watched you do. I am a physician. Managing particulars is the position. Nora, she looked at him. I am proud of you, he said. I do not say that as a qualified thing or a partial thing. I am completely and simply proud of you. She was quiet for a moment. The fire popped softly. You are the first person in my professional life who has said that to me and meant it without qualification, she said. Then they were all fools, he said. She smiled at the fire. He watched her smile. The room was warm and the world outside was white and frozen and enormous, and inside this small house on the Kansas prairie was everything worth having. Come here, he said. She looked at him, one eyebrow slightly lifted, the expression she deployed when something required evaluation. Come sit with me, he said in the simple, direct way that was his voice when he was not being careful. You have been cold for 3 hours and there is room enough and I would like you beside me. She moved to his chair. There was, indeed, room enough, if she sat with her back against his side and his arm came around her, and the fire was in front of them, and the coffee was warm in her hands. She settled against him, and he was warm in the specific deep way that tall, well-built men are warm, like a good stone that holds the sun past dark, and she relaxed into it with the slow release of tension that is different from ordinary tiredness because it comes from the inside, from the untightening of a guard that has been kept up for a very long time. He pressed his lips to her hair, very quietly, without announcement. I love you, he said into the top of her head. Every day more than the day before. Every day more than the day before, she said back to him, turning the words over so they were hers too, and they sat together with the fire and the winter and the weight of everything behind them and before them, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the thing that, when you find it, makes all the previous chapters of your life make sense in retrospect, because without them, you would not have been exactly the right person to arrive at exactly this place. Spring came again the way it always does on the plains, not gently, but with conviction, arriving all at once with a week of soft rain followed by an explosion of green so complete that the world seemed to have repainted itself overnight. The kitchen garden was planted earlier this year, with considerably more sunflowers than the year before, which Holt planted himself without comment, while Nora planted the medicinal herbs in their careful rows and did not say anything either, because some conversations are better conducted in seeds than in words. The new addition to the house was begun in April. Holt hired 2 men from town to help with the construction, a carpenter named Albert Frey and his apprentice, a young man of 20 named Will Stokes, and Nora watched the structure rise over the course of 3 weeks with a feeling that she could not quite identify until she recognized it as being, at its core, the feeling of permanence. She was not visiting this land. She was not an arrangement that was temporary and contingent. She was here, in stone and wood and cedar plank, as anchored to this specific place on the Kansas plain as the windmill over the well and the limestone walls of the barn. The practice room was completed in May and opened to patients in June, and the first patient through the new east-facing window door was old Amos Kettner, the farrier, who had a knee that had been refusing to behave since the previous autumn and who was deeply skeptical of medical intervention, but had been persuaded by his wife, who was deeply practical. Nora assessed the knee with her thorough, unhurried care, prescribed a course of treatment that included a brace, a salicylate powder, and the specific instruction to stay off it for 2 weeks, and sent him home with enough of the powder to manage the immediate pain and a follow-up appointment in 10 days. He returned in 10 days and reported, with the gruff satisfaction of a man who did not like being wrong about his skepticism, but was going to deal with the facts as they presented themselves, that the knee was 90% improved. He told everyone he knew, which was everyone in Caldwell. In July, 2 years after Nora had stepped off the stagecoach with her medicine bag and her level gray eyes and her total disinterest in being managed, she stood in the kitchen on a warm Sunday morning and told Holt that she was pregnant. He was at the stove, tending the bacon, and he turned from it immediately and really looked at her, with that whole attention look that was his particular gift. And the expression on his face was the one she had come to love most, the open, unguarded one, the one that had nothing behind it but exactly what it appeared to be. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and took her face in his hands carefully, as if she were something of great value, which she was, and he said absolutely nothing for a moment, just looked at her, and she saw his eyes bright with feeling he was not going to apologize for. "Are you happy?" he asked. "I am very happy," she said. He kissed her, not the measured, careful kisses of a man who is always half watching himself, but the complete and whole kind, the kind that says everything at once and requires no further translation, and she kissed him back with the fullness of everything she felt, which was considerable, which was vast, which was all of it. He was extremely attentive during the pregnancy, which required managing, because Nora was in the specific position of a physician who was her own most inconvenient patient. She knew exactly what was happening in her body, and she had strong opinions about appropriate activity levels, and Holt had strong opinions about her not lifting heavy equipment, and these 2 sets of opinions intersected at unexpected angles throughout the summer and autumn. They negotiated. They always negotiated. It was one of the great practical pleasures of their marriage, the fact that they both held their positions with conviction and could disagree without the world ending, and could usually arrive, through the straightforward application of honesty, at a place that was better than where either of them had started. She continued seeing patients through the pregnancy, with adjustments in the later months. Deke took over the farther ranch calls as her escort when Holt was occupied with the autumn cattle work, a duty he performed with silent dedication, and the particular expression of a man who is doing something he finds meaningful and will deny this until his last breath. Teddy Ortega's wife, a warm and capable woman named Francesca who had grown up on a ranching family in New Mexico territory, became Nora's companion in the late pregnancy weeks. Not because Nora asked for company, but because Francesca had had 2 children of her own, and understood with the specific feminine knowledge of experienced mothers that company in the final weeks is not a luxury, but a form of practical wisdom, and that the best form of it is the kind offered without fuss or fanfare. The baby came in December, on a cold, clear night when the stars were bright enough to navigate by and the windmill was singing in the northwest wind. He came in the way of first babies, not easily, not quickly, but with a stubborn, eventual determination that his parents would later recognize as characteristic. Francesca attended, and Holt, after a brief, early negotiation about whether he would remain in the room that ended with Nora making clear that she wanted him there, and that what she wanted was going to happen, Holt remained in the room, standing close, holding her hand when she needed it held and doing exactly what was asked of him and nothing else, which was, she thought in the clear rational interval between one contraction and the next, exactly what she had always needed from another person and had not before him managed to find. The baby was a boy, born just past midnight, with a good, strong voice and the particular look of newborns who have just completed an enormous project and want everyone to know about it. He was placed in Nora's arms, and she held him with the hands that had delivered 4 dozen babies over the past 2 years, and felt the radical difference between holding someone else's child and holding your own, felt it in the marrow, in the center of her chest, in the place where all the careful professional composure lived, and which had nothing to say about this at all. Holt sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and the expression on his face was so undefended, so completely open, that Nora reached over with her free hand and took his, and he gripped it and leaned down and rested his forehead against her hair for a long moment, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment was not already saying more completely than words could manage. They named the boy James. James Calloway, after Holt's father, who had died when Holt was 12, and who had been, by all accounts Holt had given her over their evenings on the porch, a good and honest man who had worked hard land with a willing heart. Nora thought it was a good name, strong but not heavy, a name a boy could grow into or out of as he chose. Deke held James on his second day of life and looked at him with an expression of complete terror that resolved very slowly into something resembling awe. He handed him back to Nora after approximately 90 seconds and said, gruffly, that he was a good-looking boy, which from Deke was essentially a declaration of emotional devastation. And Nora thanked him with the straight face she maintained until he had gone back outside, at which point she smiled at Holt and he smiled back, and they were both, simultaneously, enormously happy. James was a good baby in the specific way that particular babies are good, not endlessly placid, but communicative, clear about what he needed and easily satisfied once it was provided, which suggested, Nora thought, a fundamental reasonableness that she hoped he had inherited from both of them. He slept in a cradle that Holt had made over 2 winter evenings from cedar wood, sanded smooth and shaped with care, and at night when James woke and Nora fed him, Holt often woke too and lay in the dark beside them with his hand resting on the cradle edge, not helping exactly, but present, which was what mattered. Spring came a third time, and with it the familiar resurrection of the prairie, and James was 4 months old and beginning to develop opinions about things, including strong opinions about being carried facing outward so he could see what was happening, which Nora accommodated and Holt found extremely funny and also extremely recognizable, since it was, he said, exactly the kind of personality trait that a person would expect from a child of hers. She was back at full practice by February. The practice had grown in her absence. She had made arrangements with a physician in Wichita to cover urgent cases, and he had done so with the conscientious professionalism of a colleague, and the community had managed, and they were glad to have her back. There was talk in the county of building a proper clinic, a real building in town dedicated to the purpose. The county commissioner, a practical man named Luther Hay, had approached Holt about it in January, and Holt had come home and told Nora about the conversation and asked what she thought. She thought it was, without question, the right development. She had views about the design, naturally. The commissioner was welcome to discuss them with her directly. Holt had smiled and said that he expected that was what would happen, and he had been right. The clinic discussion proceeded through the spring with the particular slow, negotiated pace of civic projects in small frontier towns, where every board foot of lumber and every nail must be justified twice, and every stakeholder has an opinion, and most of the opinions contradict each other. Nora navigated this with the patient persistence of someone who had gotten a medical degree in a room full of men who had doubts, and had done so by showing up every day and doing the work better than anyone could reasonably dismiss. She sat in the commissioner's office in April and laid out, with the precision of someone who had been thinking about this for 2 years, the case for a county-funded clinic, the reduced mortality rates for people with access to consistent care, the economic cost of illness in a working agricultural community, the specific vulnerability of the homesteader families who were too far from town and too isolated to manage emergencies alone. She brought papers. She brought numbers. She brought the specific, undeniable testimony of the outcomes she had achieved over 2 years with limited resources. And she said plainly that with proper resources those outcomes would be better and more consistent. Luther Hay said, when she was done, that she was the most persuasive person he had encountered in 12 years of county government. He meant it as a compliment. She took it as one. The clinic was approved for funding in May 1881. It was built over the summer, a proper 2-room structure on the south end of Main Street with a good stove and a sign over the door that said Caldwell Medical Clinic and a smaller line beneath it that said Dr. N. Calloway, physician. Nora stood in front of it on the morning it opened and looked at the sign for a long time, and Holt stood beside her with James on his hip. James, at 16 months, had strong views about the ground and preferred elevation, and he put his free arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him and looked at the sign. Dr. N. Calloway, she said. Dr. N. Calloway, he confirmed. I thought I would feel strange about the name, she said, about not using Ellison professionally. Do you? She considered it honestly, the way she considered everything. "No," she said. "Ellison was who I was in a place that did not see me clearly. Calloway is who I am here." She paused. "It suits me." He kissed the side of her head. James reached out from Holt's arm and grabbed Nora's sleeve with the proprietary grip of a boy who likes to maintain contact with both parents simultaneously. And Nora took his small hand and kissed his fingers, and he looked at her with Holt's exact eyes, brown and steady and entirely direct, and smiled the wide, uncomplicated smile of a child who has never had a reason not to trust the world. The clinic served the county for years and years to come. People came from 20 miles in every direction, and the 22-mile ride to Wichita became a ride people took by choice rather than necessity. Nora trained 2 assistants over the following years, a young woman of 21 named Clara Marsh, who had a gift for patient care and a mind that moved quickly, and who Nora recognized immediately as someone who should go to medical school, and told her so, and meant it. And a young man named Elias who had arrived in Caldwell with one of the Exotister communities in the spring of 1881, and who had been apprenticing with a midwife in his home community, and who had the hands and the instincts of a natural healer, and who, under Nora's teaching, became an essential part of the clinic's work and an important bridge to the homesteading families who had traveled from the South and who, in their justified wariness of institutions, trusted Elias in ways they were not yet ready to trust anyone new. This was something Nora took seriously, the particular responsibility of a physician in a community where not everyone had equal access to care, where some families had reason to be cautious, where the history of what had happened to people far from home was still being written and would be written in the bodies of those who survived it. She was not naive about her limitations, about the things that trust required and how long it took to build, about the injustice of a world that had given some people so little cause to believe they would be treated with dignity. She did what she could, which was to be consistent, to be honest, to train Elias and compensate him fairly and stand beside him publicly. And when a county commissioner suggested once that the clinic's association with the Exotister community was creating a political difficulty, to say clearly and without anger that she was a physician, and that the only criterion for receiving care at her clinic was need, and that she trusted the commissioner was not suggesting she change that. The commissioner, to his credit, said he was not suggesting that. He had the look of a man who had briefly confused his political instincts with his better judgment and was in the process of correcting the error. Holt heard about this conversation secondhand from Luther Hay, who had been present, and he told Nora at supper that evening what he had heard, and she said that she hoped she had not been too direct, and Holt said that he had never once in 2 years been concerned about her being too direct, only sometimes too sparing with her own comfort in the service of being direct about things that mattered, which was a problem he intended to do something about. And she said that she would like to see him try. And he said that was exactly the kind of challenge he preferred, and they looked at each other across the supper table in the warm kitchen of their house, with James in his chair eating corn mash. With enormous concentration, and both of them were smiling, and both of them knew exactly where they were and wanted to be nowhere else. The second baby arrived in 1883. A girl this time, born in the new clinic with everything to hand that Nora could have wanted, a birth so efficiently managed that the attending Clara Marsh, who Nora had trained and who had trained herself past Nora's training, and was now, at 23, a formidable practitioner in her own right, told Nora afterward that she was the best-behaved patient she had ever managed, which Nora took as a professional compliment. The girl was named Eliza, after nobody in particular and for the sound of it, which Holt said was as good a reason as any to name a child something. She came into the world with excellent lung capacity and an expression of alert curiosity that her parents recognized as familiar on both their faces, which suggested she would be, in all the ways that mattered, completely herself. James, 3 years old, regarded his sister for a full 2 minutes from the doorway of the clinic room, and then announced that she was very small, which was accurate, and that her name was difficult to say, which was less accurate but was the kind of opinion a 3-year-old boy is entitled to have. He revised his position over the following months, as Eliza developed the capacity for interaction and demonstrated a particularly strong interest in her brother's activities, which James eventually decided was a reasonable quality in a sister. The years accumulated as good years do, not quietly, because there was nothing quiet about a working ranch and a medical clinic and 2 children growing at the pace that children grow, but deeply, building on each other layer on layer, the way good soil builds, the way the plains themselves were built over long patient time into something rich and solid and capable of sustaining a great deal. Holt expanded the cattle operation in 1882, adding a horse breeding program that Deke managed with the particular devotion of a man who has found his true calling and is operating it at full capacity. Teddy Ortega and Francesca built a proper house on the east corner of the property and became as much a part of the Calloway household as Deke, who lived in the bunkhouse but ate at the family table more often than not and had never, not once, in all the years since Nora stepped off the stagecoach, made her feel anything but entirely at home. Clara Marsh went to the Woman's Medical College of Pennsylvania in the fall of 1883, sponsored in part by a collection of county residents who thought this was money well spent, and partly by Nora herself, who wrote the letter of recommendation with an enthusiasm that surprised Clara until Clara read it, at which point she cried briefly and then composed herself and went to pack. Elias became the clinic's primary care provider during the periods when Nora was occupied at the ranch, and the community he served grew steadily more trusting of the institution he represented, which was the outcome Nora had always believed was possible if you simply showed up consistently enough. On an October evening in 1884, 5 years after Nora had stepped off the stagecoach with her medicine bag and Holt had said the words he later considered the most wrong thing he had ever said, which she would occasionally invoke, gently and with humor, when she needed to win a disagreement, deploying it not as a weapon, but as a reminder that people grow. They sat on the porch in the October evening, as they had sat on so many evenings before, with the tall grass golden in the last light and the air carrying the smoke and dry leaf smell of autumn, and James, who was 5, was chasing something through the kitchen garden that may or may not have been a grasshopper, and Eliza was asleep in her cradle inside with the window open so they could hear her, and the sunflowers along the south fence had finished their season and stood in tall, bent rows with the dried heads full of seeds that the birds would find in the days to come. Holt had his coffee and she had her tea, and the stars were beginning above the darkening blue of the western horizon, and she thought about the letter she had written to a matrimonial agency in St. Louis 6 years ago, the first real act of defiance of her life, the choice to take herself west rather than allow what had happened in Philadelphia to define what happened next. She thought about the stagecoach and the dust and the man at the post outside the dry goods store who had said the wrong thing for the right reasons, which she had understood from the first, and which she had been willing to work with because she had understood something else too, looking at him, something underneath the wrong words, something that recognized the same quality in her that she had recognized in him, the kind of fundamental honesty that is not always comfortable but is always, finally, the most durable foundation for anything worth building. "What are you thinking about?" Holt asked. "The stagecoach," she said. He groaned softly, which was his response to this topic, and which was also not entirely serious, as she knew perfectly well. He had made his peace with the stagecoach years ago. He had said so explicitly and she had believed him, and when he groaned she knew he was groaning at himself, at the younger, more rigid man he had been, who had stood in the dust of the main street of Caldwell, and failed to understand that the best things that happen to a person almost never come in the form expected. I was thinking, she continued, that it is the thing I am most grateful for. The stagecoach. What happened on it, what I found when I got off it. He put his hand over hers on the arm of the porch chair, and she turned her hand over and linked her fingers through his. I was thinking, he said, about what it would have looked like, my life, if the agency had sent someone different. A domestic woman, she said, someone who could cook and mend. Someone I would have been very bored with inside a year, he said honestly, and who would have been very bored with me. And we both would have made the best of it and called it fine, and neither of us would have known what we were missing. He paused. I would have missed you, he said, without knowing what I was missing. Nora looked at him in the fading light. Holt Calloway, she said. Nora Calloway, he said. That was nearly poetic. Do not tell Deke, he said. She laughed. It was the kind of laugh that came up from somewhere real, clear and full and without any guard on it at all, and it went out into the October evening over the prairie and dissolved into the enormous silence of the plain, and James looked up from whatever he was chasing in the kitchen garden and said, "What is funny?" And Holt said, "Everything," and James considered this and went back to the grasshopper. Later, when the children were in bed and the lamps were low, and the house had settled into the particular nighttime peace of a well-built structure on a solid foundation, Nora stood at the window of the bedroom and looked out at the prairie dark, the stars enormous and thick above the flat horizon, the windmill turning slowly in the night breeze, the outbuildings sitting solid and familiar in the starlight. Holt came and stood behind her, and she leaned back against him, and his arms came around her, warm and certain. What was wrong with being a doctor? She said quietly, into the dark outside the window. Absolutely nothing, he said into her hair. I was a fool. You were learning, she said. We were both learning. I am still learning, he said. So am I, she said. That is the whole point. The windmill turned and the stars held their places overhead, and the prairie was vast and dark and full of its own profound life. And inside the stone and plank house that Holt had built and that Nora had made into a home, two people who had found each other through the unlikely machinery of a frontier matrimonial advertisement stood at a window in the good dark, utterly in love with the life they had made together, and were content in the way that only comes to people who have been honest about what they wanted and brave enough to reach for it. The kitchen garden had already been put to bed for winter, the stems cut back and the soil mulched against the cold. The sunflowers along the south fence were down to their bare stalks, waiting for spring, ready to come again. They always came again. That was the thing about sunflowers, Nora had told him once. They were not delicate. They were built for exactly this landscape, for the full heat of the Kansas summer and the sweep of the prairie wind and the long, patient wait of winter. They were built to come back. As were, it turned out, two people who had been looking for the right place and without quite expecting to, had found it in each other. The next spring, the sunflowers came up thicker than before, and James helped plant them this time, carrying the seeds in his small cupped hands with the focused care of a boy who has been told that these matter and believes it completely. And Eliza sat in the kitchen garden dirt, with the democratic enthusiasm of a toddler who has not yet learned to distinguish between gardening and playing in soil, which amounts to the same thing at that age, and probably at most ages if you are honest about it. And Nora planted the medicinal herbs in their careful rows, and Holt turned the soil at the border where the vegetables would go, and Deke came out of the barn to say something critical about the sunflower placement that he had been saying every spring for 5 years and which was his way of participating. And the prairie morning went on around them in its vast, indifferent, magnificent way. And the life they were living was exactly, precisely, completely the life that each of them, had they been asked before any of this began, would have said they did not know how to want. But they had found their way to it anyway, through a stagecoach and a medicine bag and a wrong sentence at a depot in a Kansas town, and through 5 years of honesty and work and the specific, sustaining warmth of two people who see each other clearly and choose, every morning, to be exactly where they are. Which is everything. Which is, in the end, the whole of it.